Every night at exactly 11 p.m., a Neapolitan Mastiff the size of a small bear crouched in the forbidden garden behind a mansion in Connecticut and dug at the same patch of earth, over and over, with the kind of desperation that doesn't belong to an animal that's been fed and sheltered its entire life. The dog's name was Cerberus. He belonged to a man named Everett Kane, 36 years old, owner of that mansion, owner of the guards standing at every door, owner of an empire so vast and so violent that even the FBI didn't have a complete file on it, just fragments and fear. Everett Kane wasn't the kind of man who raised his voice because he'd never needed to. He spoke quietly, moved slowly, and the temperature in every room he entered dropped by 10 degrees, not because of the air conditioning, but because of what people understood about what he was capable of. He'd built his entire kingdom on one single belief, that the people who were supposed to love him had looked him in the eye and walked away without turning back. And he made sure, every single day for 17 years, that he would never need another human being again. But nobody told the dog. Every night, Cerberus went to that same forbidden corner and dug. Chains, fences, locked doors. Nothing stopped him. No one on the staff could explain it. No one dared to ask why the boss kept that section of his own garden permanently off limits. Now, the only person who came anywhere near that garden on a regular basis wasn't a guard, wasn't an associate, wasn't anyone from Everett Kane's world at all. She was a delivery driver named Lydia Mercer, 27 years old, with dark circles under her eyes so permanent they looked painted on, and a van with a cracked windshield and a check engine light that hadn't turned off in 4 months. Lydia worked the night shift for a small courier company, delivering specialty groceries to addresses she never questioned, because that paycheck was the only thing standing between her and the street. During the day, the woman didn't sleep. She sat beside her grandmother Ruth, 81 years old, in a studio apartment in Bridgeport where the rent was 3 months overdue, rubbing lavender oil into the old woman's hands every morning to calm her down when Alzheimer's stole another piece of her mind overnight. Lydia Mercer wasn't poor because she'd failed at life. She was poor because she'd made a choice that looked like love from the inside and looked like slow destruction from the outside, to carry every person around her who couldn't carry themselves, and that weight had quietly crushed her flat without anyone noticing. The Kane mansion was the last stop on her nightly route. The rules were simple. Walk through the back garden, leave the packages at the kitchen door, ring the bell, and leave. Don't linger. Don't look around. Lydia had followed those rules perfectly for 3 weeks straight. But every one of those nights, walking that dark garden path, she'd heard the same sound: claws scraping dirt, heavy breathing, the low, relentless rhythm of Cerberus digging at something he couldn't reach. And every one of those nights, Lydia told herself it wasn't her business, and kept walking. Until tonight. Tonight the sound was different. Not just digging. A whimper. Low, pained, continuous. Cerberus was still going at the earth, but his right front paw was sliced open, bleeding into the dirt, and the animal hadn't stopped. The smart thing to do was walk away. Every survival instinct Lydia had told her to keep moving. But this woman had spent her entire adult life choosing compassion over self-preservation, and that's exactly why she ended up kneeling in the mud beside a 140-pound bleeding dog in the backyard of the most dangerous man in Connecticut. Lydia placed her hand on his side gently. Cerberus didn't growl. He didn't snap. He just looked at her with wet, dark eyes and turned back toward the hole. She reached into the dirt where he'd been digging, and her fingers closed around something small, round, and hard. She pulled it free. A ring. Platinum. Old. Expensive. And covering every inch of its surface, dried into every groove like it had been soaked before it was buried, was blood. And what happened next changed everything, not just for the woman holding that ring, but for the man who owned the garden, the empire, and the lie he'd been living for 17 years. If this story already has its hooks in you, hit subscribe, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs a story that won't let go. Now let's go back to the moment that ring came out of the ground, because what was buried underneath it was far worse than blood. Lydia hadn't even had time to straighten up before every light in the garden flared on at once, stark white and cold, as if the entire estate had just been stripped bare in the middle of the night. She lifted a hand to shield her eyes, her heart pounding so hard she could feel its rhythm jerking in her throat. The sound of footsteps on the gravel came right after, fast, heavy, purposeful. Not the sound of someone running, but the sound of someone walking who didn't need to run, because everything around him would stop on its own when he arrived. Everett Kane stepped out through the back door of the mansion. 2 armed men followed close behind him, one on each side, but Lydia didn't really see them, because she couldn't take her eyes off the man in the middle. He wore a black shirt, the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and he had no shoes on, walking barefoot over the wet gravel, as if he had rushed out of bed or away from his desk, the very instant the security system sounded the alarm. But nothing in his face suggested haste. There was only control. The kind of control Lydia had never seen in anyone before, as though every muscle in his face took orders from some very deep place inside him, and not a single one was allowed to move without permission. He stopped 3 steps away from her. His eyes moved from her face down to her hands, smeared with mud, smeared with blood, and to the ring lying in the center of her right palm. He didn't shout. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't ask what she was doing. He only said, his voice so low that Lydia had to hold her breath to hear it clearly, "Give it to me." Lydia didn't think. Her body reacted before her mind could. Her hand opened, and Everett took the ring from her palm with 2 fingers, with a gentleness so unnatural compared with everything else that was happening. He held it at eye level, turned it slowly, then angled the ring toward the light, and Lydia saw his lips move as he read the inscription inside. He didn't read it aloud, but she was close enough to see the 4 characters reflected backward in his pupils. MK forever. W. Something changed. Not a large change, not the kind where someone screams or collapses. It was far smaller than that, but 100 times deeper. His jaw tightened, his throat swallowed once, slowly, with control, as if he were forcing something back into the place it had escaped from. His eyes never left the ring, but his gaze had changed. He wasn't looking at an object anymore. He was looking into something very far away, very old, and very painful. That moment lasted no more than 3 seconds. Then it vanished. Everett Kane's face returned to stillness, flat as dark water at night, and he turned to one of the 2 bodyguards without looking at Lydia. "Take her inside." It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't a threat. It was simply an order. The same kind of order as close the door or turn off the light. Something that would happen whether the listener agreed to it or not. Lydia wanted to say something. Wanted to explain that she was only a delivery driver, that the dog was hurt, that she hadn't meant to trespass. But one of the bodyguards had already placed a hand on her shoulder and guided her toward the back door, not roughly, but without leaving even the smallest space for refusal. She walked, but just before going inside, Lydia looked back once. Everett Kane was still standing there, alone in the garden, beneath the cold white lights, his back turned to her. The ring lay inside his right fist, clenched so tightly that his entire arm trembled. His shoulders trembled. And though Lydia Mercer knew nothing about this man beyond his name and the rumors surrounding him, she understood one thing with absolute clarity in that moment. What she had just pulled up from the ground wasn't a ring. It was something this man had buried inside himself, deeper than any hole the dog could ever dig down to. M.K. stood for Monroe Kane, his mother. And that ring was her wedding ring. The ring that, throughout the 19 years Everett had lived under the same roof with her, he had never once seen her take off. Not when she washed dishes, not when she gardened, not when she slept. That ring was part of Monroe Kane's body, in the way a wedding ring only becomes when the person wearing it loves the one who gave it to her, with a kind of love that doesn't need to be explained or proven to anyone. W. was Warren Kane, his father, the man who had engraved the word forever on the inside of that ring on their wedding day and never spoke about it, because he wasn't the kind of man who talked about things like that. He simply lived with it every day by still being there, still coming home, still sitting at the head of the dinner table every night, until the night both he and she disappeared. Everett stood in his study at 1 a.m, the door locked, the ring lying on the dark wooden desk in front of him, and 17 years of memory came flooding back in a way he couldn't stop, even though he had spent his whole life teaching himself how to stop everything. 17 years ago, Everett Kane had been 19 years old, freshly done with the first mission the organization had given him. He didn't remember the details of that mission anymore, because his mind had erased them long ago in the way the human mind protects itself from things it knows it shouldn't keep. But he remembered the feeling of driving home afterward, the feeling of the steering wheel damp with sweat beneath his hands, the feeling of wanting to sit down at the kitchen table with his mother and hear her say anything, any sentence at all, as long as it was her voice. He remembered turning onto the familiar road and seeing the house in the Hartford suburbs still standing there in the dark, looking normal, looking like every other night. But when he opened the door, the air inside was wrong. There was no smell of cooking, no low television sound from the living room, no pair of his mother's slippers by the entryway. The furniture was still there. The table and chairs were still in their proper places. But the soul of the house had been drained out of it, as if someone had come and carried away the one thing that made those four walls a home instead of just four walls. On the kitchen table, there was a letter. His mother's handwriting, the letters leaning slightly to the right. The script he recognized immediately because it was the same handwriting that had signed every field trip permission slip, every birthday card, every note left on the refrigerator throughout his childhood. The letter said, "We can't be part of the life you've chosen. Don't look for us." There was no other explanation. No, I love you. No, I'm sorry. Just two sentences, cold and final, as if the person writing them had weighed every word and decided that her son deserved only two sentences before being cut out of their lives forever. Everett called his mother. The number had been disconnected. He called his father. The same result. He drove to his grandmother's house, his aunt's house, his mother's friends' houses. Every place he could think of. No one knew anything. No one had seen anything. Two people had evaporated from the face of the earth without leaving a trace beyond two sentences on a sheet of paper. He returned to the empty house at 3 a.m. and sat at the kitchen table, the letter in front of him, trying to understand how 19 years of being the son of two people could end with a piece of paper. That was when Ford Beckett came. Ford was 35 then, had been in the organization longer than Everett, had brought Everett in, had guided him from the earliest days. He opened the door without knocking, saw Everett sitting there with the letter, and didn't ask a single question. He simply placed a hand on Everett's shoulder, heavy, warm, steady, and said, "They don't deserve you, but I'm here. I'm always here." Everett Kane, at 19 years old, believed those words. He believed them because he had no one else left to believe. And from that night on, he burned away every soft thing still left inside him, the way people burn old letters, page by page, until there was nothing left that could catch fire. He built an empire out of the anger of an abandoned son. Every deal, every piece of territory taken, every enemy brought down, was built on the same foundation. If he was strong enough, rich enough, frightening enough, then no one would dare walk away again. For 17 years, he had lived with that story. For 17 years, he had believed that his parents had looked at him, weighed him, and decided he wasn't worth staying for. But now, at 1 a.m, the wedding ring Monroe Kane had never taken off was lying on the desk in front of him, stained with dried blood, dug up from the garden behind his own house by his own dog. And the question Everett Kane could no longer avoid, even though he had spent his entire life avoiding every question whose answer he couldn't control, was this. If his mother had left of her own free will, why had the ring she treated like part of her own body been buried under the ground, in the garden of his house, stained with something that looked very much like blood? The next morning, Lydia was still sitting in the mansion's living room, in the exact chair the bodyguard had pointed her toward the night before, still in the clothes stained with mud, still with the smell of damp earth and dog blood on her hands, and no one had brought her even a towel to wipe them clean. She hadn't slept. Not because she was afraid, though she had every good reason to be afraid, but because she couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Ruth at home alone, with no one beside her if she woke in a panic at 3 a.m, while Noah was too far away to know what she needed. Every minute Lydia sat inside this house was a minute Mrs. Ruth had no one. And that was what truly made her feel as if she couldn't breathe. Not the guns, not the man as cold as stone who owned this place. Everett Kane met with her at around 6 a.m. He had changed his clothes, shaved, and looked like a completely different man from the barefoot one whose shoulders had trembled in the dark garden last night. He sat down in the chair across from her, not close, not far, set both hands on his thighs, and looked at her in silence long enough for Lydia to understand that this man wasn't in the habit of opening his mouth before he had already decided every word he was going to say. Then he spoke, not at length. He didn't explain what the ring was. He didn't explain the garden. He didn't give her any information she didn't need to know. He simply made an offer. And the way he used the word offer made Lydia understand at once that this wasn't the kind of offer a person could refuse and then stand up and go home. He needed someone to look after Cerberus every night. The dog had injured itself digging, and it would keep digging if no one stopped it. His bodyguards couldn't do it because Cerberus wouldn't let anyone touch him except Everett. But last night he had let her touch him, and that was the first time in his whole life that Dog had accepted the hand of a stranger. In return, he would pay her 5 times what she made from deliveries each night. And there was only one condition: not one word to anyone about the ring, about the garden, about anything she saw or heard inside this property. Lydia sat still for about 10 seconds. She didn't look at him. She looked down at her hands, still marked with dried mud beneath the nails, and she did the math in her head. Rent 3 months late, Mrs. Ruth's Alzheimer's medication that insurance didn't cover. Nearly $400 a month out of pocket. Noah's next semester tuition, which she had promised she would handle, though she still had no idea where the money would come from. The check engine light on the van, which she knew, if she didn't get it fixed soon, would die on the road some night and cost her the only job keeping all 3 of them from hitting bottom. She knew this was a deal with a dangerous man. She knew that stepping in deeper meant it would be harder to step back out. But Lydia Mercer had lived 27 years by one very simple rule. When she had to choose between her own safety and keeping the people she loved from falling apart, she always chose the latter. Every time. And every time, it made her life harder. But she still chose. "I need to be home before 2 in the morning," she said. Every night. No exceptions. Everett looked at her for one more beat, then nodded. He didn't ask why. The first night she returned, Lydia parked the van at the side gate as usual, carried the delivery crates to the kitchen door, rang the bell, then walked around to the back garden. She expected she would have to find Cerberus, maybe call him, maybe wait. But the dog was already there. He was sitting right by the side gate, facing the street, ears lifted, as if he had heard the van from the road and had come to wait before she even had time to turn off the engine. Lydia stopped walking. Cerberus stood, came to her, his head lowered, his tail swaying slowly, then pressed his cold, wet nose into her palm, as if he had decided the night before that this hand belonged to him. She sat down on the grass beside him and cleaned the wound on his leg with the first aid kit someone had left ready on a chair in the garden. And while she worked, the dog, weighing more than 60 kilograms, lay down beside her, rested his head on her lap, and breathed evenly. He didn't dig that night. On the second night, Cerberus was waiting at the gate again. On the third night, he began following her from the kitchen door out to the garden, instead of waiting for her to come to him. On the fourth night, when Lydia sat on the grass and spoke softly to him while cleaning the nearly healed wound, she didn't know that on the second floor of the mansion, Everett Kane was standing by the window looking down into the garden, looking at the dog who had refused to let anyone touch him for his entire life, now lying peacefully at the feet of a delivery girl, and he was trying to understand why the only living creature on earth he trusted had chosen to trust a stranger before he had even decided whether she was worthy of trust at all. Lydia noticed the car for the first time on the 5th night after she began taking care of Cerberus. She left the Kane mansion at 1:45 in the morning, turned onto the main road toward Bridgeport, and when she stopped at the first red light and checked the rearview mirror out of habit, she saw it. A black sedan, its headlights off, parked about 4 cars behind her. Not moving, but not turned off either, because Lydia could see a faint breath of exhaust rising from the tailpipe in the cold air. The light turned green, and she drove. The sedan followed. She turned right. It turned right. She changed lanes. It changed lanes, always keeping the same distance, 3 to 4 cars back, close enough not to lose her, but far enough that Lydia couldn't read the license plate in the small rearview mirror of the van, scratched and clouded with age. When she turned into the Bridgeport neighborhood, the sedan stopped at the last intersection before the residential block and didn't go any farther. It simply sat there, lights off, engine running, as if whoever was inside only needed to know where she lived, and that was enough. Lydia parked in front of the apartment, turned off the engine, and sat in the van for another 5 minutes with her hands gripping the steering wheel. She didn't call the police. People who lived in this neighborhood didn't call the police, because the police took 40 minutes to arrive, and trouble only needed 4 seconds to happen. She didn't call Everett either, because that wasn't how Lydia Mercer operated. She had grown up in Bridgeport, lived in buildings where people didn't ask their neighbors what was going on, because asking meant getting involved, and getting involved meant trouble had found one more address. The rule of survival had been carved into her bones since she was a child. Don't bring your trouble to the door of the person paying you, because the money can stop, but the trouble won't. On the 6th night, the sedan came back. Same position, same distance, same way of moving. This time, Lydia deliberately slowed down while passing a stretch of road bright with streetlights, hoping to read the plate in the mirror. But the car dropped back at once, widening the distance as though the driver knew exactly what she was trying to do. This wasn't a car thief or some amateur stalker. This person knew how to tail someone without being identified, and that frightened Lydia far more than simply being followed. On the 7th night, the sedan didn't appear. Lydia drove from the Kane mansion back to Bridgeport without seeing anything unusual in the rearview mirror. And for the first time in 3 nights, she let out a breath when she turned off the engine in front of her building. But when she stepped out of the van and walked around to the front to get her bag, she stopped. The right side mirror of the van had been folded inward. Not broken, not struck, but folded in by hand, carefully, deliberately, the way someone does when they want to send a message instead of causing damage. It had happened during the time she was inside the Kane mansion. That meant someone knew her schedule, knew where she parked, knew what time she entered the mansion and what time she left, knew exactly how long she would be inside, long enough to get to her van and leave a sign without being seen. Lydia stood beside the van in the darkness of Bridgeport, looking at the folded mirror, and understood with painful clarity that this wasn't a coincidence, and it wasn't the last time. Someone was watching her come and go from the Kane mansion, and that person wanted her to know they were watching. She folded the side mirror back into place, went inside, checked that Mrs. Ruth was sleeping peacefully, locked the door, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling until morning without closing her eyes. She still didn't tell Everett, not because she believed she could handle it, but because she knew that in the world of a man like Everett Kane, when someone brought him a problem, he would solve it in his own way, and that way might make the problem disappear, but it might make Lydia disappear along with it, not because he wanted that, but because when men like him solved something, the waves they made didn't care who was standing nearby. On the 9th night, Lydia was sitting on the grass beside Cerberus, her back resting against the trunk of an oak tree at the edge of the garden, speaking softly to the dog the way she had done every night since she began, when she heard the back door of the mansion open and then close again very quietly. She didn't turn her head, but her body went rigid. The hand stroking Cerberus's head stopped halfway through the motion, and the dog lifted his head to look toward the door, then lowered it back onto her lap, calm, as if he knew who was coming and had decided that person wasn't worth standing up for. Everett Kane stopped about 4 meters away from her. He didn't sit down. He didn't say why he was here. He only stood there with both hands in his trouser pockets, looking at the dog who, for 17 years, had allowed only him to touch him, now curled beside a woman he had known for less than 2 weeks, and the way the dog lay there, completely loose, his belly slightly exposed, breathing evenly, was the way a dog only lies when he feels absolutely safe. The silence stretched long enough for the sound of crickets and the wind passing through the oak leaves to become the only sound between them. Then Everett spoke, not looking at her, his eyes still on Cerberus. "What do you say to him every night?" Lydia didn't answer right away. She weighed what she should say to this man, how much she should say, how much she should keep hidden. But then she looked down at Cerberus, breathing steadily on her lap, and thought that if this dog trusted her enough to lie with his belly exposed in front of her, perhaps she could tell his owner the truth about one thing. "I tell him about my grandmother," Lydia said. "My grandmother has Alzheimer's. Late stage. Most of the time, she doesn't know who I am." She paused, not because she was overcome, but because she was choosing her words, carefully, in the way of someone used to telling her sad story, without letting it become a burden for the person listening. "Every morning I sit beside her and say, 'I'm Lydia, your granddaughter.' Every morning. The same sentence. And every morning she looks at me as if she's meeting me for the first time." She slowly stroked Cerberus's ear. "Cerberus is the only one I talk to without having to explain who I am. He doesn't forget me overnight. He doesn't need me to prove that I belong here. He just listens." Everett said nothing. The garden was silent. The wind moved through the oak canopy, making a sound as soft as someone whispering from very far away. Then he did something Lydia didn't expect. He sat down, not on a chair, not on the steps, but down on the grass, about 1 meter from her, his legs stretched in front of him, his back slightly bent, both hands resting on his knees, on the same ground as her, at the same height. For the first time since Lydia had stepped onto this property, Everett Kane wasn't standing above her and looking down. He didn't look at her. He looked out toward the dark garden, toward the patch of earth where Cerberus had dug up the ring. And during the time the two of them sat there without saying anything, Lydia understood something she wasn't sure Everett wanted her to understand. He hadn't come out to the garden tonight because of the dog. He had come because this was the only place in his vast mansion where there was the sound of a human voice speaking, not because it had been given an order, not because it was afraid, not because it needed something from him. It was only the voice of a woman speaking softly to a dog about her grandmother, and maybe that was the closest sound to something Everett Kane had once had 17 years ago, when his mother was still here. They sat in the garden for nearly another half-hour. They didn't say another word. Cerberus lay between them, his head on Lydia's lap, his tail brushing lightly against Everett's leg each time the wind blew. That was all that happened that night. No touch, no declaration, no dramatic moment, just two lonely people sitting on the wet grass in the dark garden of a mansion that one of them owned and the other had only been hired by chance to care for a dog, and both of them pretending this was normal, while both of them knew it was the first time in a very long while they had sat near another person without feeling the need to explain why they were there. Lydia got back to the apartment in Bridgeport at 2:15 in the morning and heard screaming from the hallway. It wasn't angry screaming. It was the kind of screaming that came from someone who didn't know where she was, didn't know who she was, and didn't know why the darkness around her felt so terrifying. Lydia ran inside. Mrs. Ruth was sitting on the bed, the blanket kicked down onto the floor, her silver hair loose and tangled, both hands gripping the bed frame as if she were trying to keep herself from falling out of the world. Her eyes were wide open, but they saw nothing familiar. Not the room she had lived in for 6 years, not the granddaughter standing in the doorway. She looked at Lydia and shrank back in fear, as if Lydia were a stranger who had just broken into the room. "Who is that? Who's here?" she screamed, her voice hoarse and high enough that the downstairs neighbor knocked on the ceiling 2 times. Lydia didn't rush to her right away. She knew that approaching too quickly during an Alzheimer's patient's panic would only make everything worse. She set her bag down on the floor, moved slowly to the side of the bed, knelt so she was level with Mrs. Ruth's eyes, and held out her hand so Mrs. Ruth could see it before she touched her. "It's Lydia, Grandma," she said, her voice soft and steady, the kind of voice she had practiced hundreds of times for exactly this kind of moment. "Your granddaughter. I live here with you. You're safe." Mrs. Ruth looked at her, still breathing hard, her fingers still white around the bed frame. Then, very slowly, little by little, the look in her eyes changed. Not recognition. Lydia had learned long ago to tell the difference between recognition and accepting a presence. But it was acceptance. As if her grandmother's mind didn't remember who she was, while her body remembered that this voice was safe, that this hand would do no harm. Mrs. Ruth let go of the bed frame. Lydia took her hand, squeezed it gently, and began speaking softly. The content didn't matter, only that her voice stayed even and continuous so Mrs. Ruth would have something to hold on to inside the darkness that was swallowing her memory piece by piece. Gradually, Mrs. Ruth's breathing slowed. Her eyes grew heavy, her body tilted back toward the pillow, and Lydia pulled the blanket up over her, gently, the way she had done thousands of times, and every time hurt like the first because every time was proof that her grandmother was drifting a little farther away from her, and Lydia had no way to pull her back. But just as Lydia was about to withdraw her hand and stand up, Mrs. Ruth's fingers tightened around hers, hard, not the weak grip of an old woman about to fall asleep, hard enough that Lydia startled and looked down. Mrs. Ruth's eyes opened, and this time there was something different in them. Not panic, not confusion. For those few brief seconds, Mrs. Ruth's eyes were unusually clear, sharp, focused, as if a door inside her mind had just swung open to let one last piece of memory slip through before it slammed shut forever. "Kane," she said, clearly. No stammering, no confusion. "Be careful, child, Kane." Then her hand loosened. Her eyes clouded over again, the brief flash of clarity going out as quickly as it had come, and she sank into sleep with the blank face of someone who had given back the last piece of memory she was still able to hold. Lydia didn't stand up. She sat there beside her grandmother's bed, in the dark room smelling of lavender and medicine, and felt her spine go cold from the nape of her neck down. Her grandmother had never once mentioned the name Kane. In all 27 years of Lydia's life, in every story Mrs. Ruth had told when her memory was still clear, in every name she had ever spoken from the past, Kane had never appeared even once. So where had she learned that name? And why, Among the millions of fragments Alzheimer's had stolen from her, was this the one fragment she had held onto until the very end? The next night, Lydia came to the mansion with her mind still echoing with the two words Mrs. Ruth had spoken before sinking into sleep. Kane and be careful. Two words Lydia didn't know what to do with. Didn't know who she should tell, didn't know whether they meant anything at all, or were only random shards from a mind falling apart. She left the delivery at the kitchen door, rang the bell, then went out to the back garden as usual. Cerberus was already waiting at the side gate, rising when he heard her footsteps, and he walked with her toward the oak tree where they usually sat. But tonight, the dog didn't lie down beside her. He went straight to the forbidden corner of the garden, the corner where the ring had been buried, and began to dig. Lydia looked at him. She was being paid to stop Cerberus from digging. That was part of the reason she was here. But tonight, after what Mrs. Ruth had said, after the black sedan, after the way the name Kane seemed to be pulling everything in her life toward the same point she couldn't yet see, Lydia didn't stop the dog. She sat on the grass a few meters away and watched. Cerberus dug at the earth with his front paws, more carefully than before because the wound on his right leg still hadn't fully healed, but no less determined. He dug slowly, pushing his nose down into the dirt after every few strokes, sniffing, then digging again, as if he were searching for something specific and not simply tearing at the ground without reason. About 15 minutes later, Cerberus stopped, pressed his nose into the hole, which was about 20 centimeters deep, then backed away and looked at Lydia. She came closer, knelt down, and reached into the dirt. Her fingers touched something soft, not metal like last time, but cloth. She pulled it up, a small piece of fabric, about the size of her palm, torn along two edges, stained with black soil and so decayed it almost came apart in her hand. But across its surface, written in something Lydia wasn't sure was ink or blood, faint but still readable beneath the garden lights, were two words: "Help me." Lydia sat back on her heels, staring at the piece of cloth in her hand, and everything inside her went cold. The blood-stained wedding ring had been strange enough, but a ring could have many explanations. These two words couldn't. Help me wasn't something a person wrote when leaving of their own free will. It wasn't something someone buried beneath the ground in the backyard of their own house, if they were walking away by choice. This was something someone left behind when they had no other way to tell the world they were in danger. Lydia could hide the cloth. She could throw it back into the dirt, cover the hole, and pretend that tonight she had only sat with the dog and then gone home. No one would know, no one would ask, and she would be much safer if she didn't carry one more secret to the man who owned this garden. But Lydia thought of Mrs. Ruth, a woman who had screamed in the dark because no one had been there when she needed someone, and she thought that if this piece of cloth belonged to someone who had screamed and no one had heard, then she had no right to bury that scream again. She folded the cloth carefully, put it into the pocket of her jacket, and walked straight into the mansion. Everett was sitting in the study on the first floor, the desk lamp glowing, an untouched glass of liquor on the desk. He looked up when Lydia entered, and his gaze stopped immediately on her hand as she pulled something from her pocket. She placed the piece of cloth on the desk in front of him, the written side facing up, without saying anything, letting him read it for himself. Everett looked down. Two words: "Help me." He didn't react right away. His eyes read those two words, then read them again, then read them one more time, as if each time he hoped he had read them wrong, and that the next time, the words on the cloth would be different, but they weren't different. Then something left him. Not loudly, not dramatically, but Lydia saw it clearly. His shoulders lowered, not with relaxation, but with the look of a weight inside him suddenly becoming too heavy for his body to keep holding the same posture. He sat down in the chair very slowly, as if gravity in this room had changed for him alone. The silence stretched on. Then Everett Kane, the man who never explained anything to anyone, opened his mouth and told Lydia Mercer things he had not spoken aloud to another human being in 17 years. "That ring was my mother's wedding ring," he said, his voice low and even, but every word heavy, as if he were lifting it up from the ground. "Monroe Kane. She wore it every day through her marriage to my father. She never took it off. Not one day. Not one." He stopped, looked at the cloth. 17 years ago she left a letter saying she didn't want to be part of my life anymore. He looked up, looked straight into Lydia's eyes, and in that gaze she saw something she had never seen in this man before. Not anger, not sorrow, but fear. "But if she left willingly," he said, Then why was her wedding ring buried in the ground of my house with blood on it? And why did someone write, "Help me," and bury it in the same place? He picked up his phone and made a single call. "Petra," he said, "I need you here now. Tonight." Ford Beckett knew Petra Shaw had come to the mansion that night because nothing happened inside this property without him knowing. He had built that system over 17 years. Every bodyguard, every employee, every camera, every stream of information passing through him before it ever reached Everett, and although Everett believed he controlled the empire, Ford knew he controlled the flow. And in any organization, the person who controls the flow is the one who holds the real power. The next morning, Ford entered Everett's study, while Everett was sitting with the ring and the piece of cloth in front of him, both sealed inside clear plastic bags like evidence, and Ford saw them at once. He revealed nothing. 52 years of living had taught Ford Beckett how to keep his face flat before anything, and 17 years of keeping a secret capable of killing him had turned that skill into instinct. He sat down in the chair across from Everett, looked at the ring in the plastic bag with an expression anyone could read as concern, and said, "I heard Petra came last night." Everett didn't answer. Ford continued, his voice even, calm, the voice of a man who had played the trusted advisor for so long that the role had become flesh. "Do you think this could be psychological warfare? We don't lack enemies. Someone knows about your mother, knows what the wedding ring looked like, buried a copy in the garden, and waited for you to lose control. Don't let emotion guide you, Everett. That's how they want you to react." Everett looked at Ford. He didn't agree. He didn't disagree. He only looked, with eyes Ford had read thousands of times over 17 years, but couldn't read this time. And that was the first thing that made Ford Beckett truly worry. Everett not arguing meant he wasn't ruling it out, but he wasn't convinced either. And an unconvinced Everett was an Everett who would keep digging, not with his hands like the dog, but with Petra Shaw and with the tracing system Petra had access to. Ford left the room and spent the next 3 hours sitting in his private car outside the parking area, thinking. He had kept this secret for 17 years. 17 years without a single mistake. He had turned the back garden into a forbidden zone, right after discovering that Monroe had tried to bury something before she was taken away. He had blocked every letter, every phone call, every attempt at contact from Warren and Monroe for nearly 2 decades. And now, a dog and a delivery girl were tearing apart everything he had built. The dog, he could do nothing about, because Everett would never allow anyone to touch Cerberus. But the delivery girl was different. She didn't belong to this world. She had no one protecting her. She was only a woman driving a cracked windshield van on night shifts in Bridgeport. And in Ford Beckett's world, people like that disappeared every day without anyone asking questions. On the 11th night, Lydia left the Kane mansion at 1:50 in the morning. She drove the van onto the main road, turned toward Bridgeport, and for the first 10 minutes, nothing was unusual. No black sedan. No one following in the rearview mirror. She began to loosen her shoulders, her left hand turning the radio dial to find any station at all to make the silence less heavy, when the headlights of a car suddenly appeared from the side road on the right, very close, very fast, shining straight into the cabin and blinding her for 2 seconds. Instinct made her jerk the wheel to the left, but the other car had already pressed in tight on her right, forcing the van toward the shoulder, metal scraping against metal with a shrill scream, and the van came to a stop when the right front tire climbed onto the grassy curb. Lydia hadn't even had time to understand what was happening before the driver's side door was yanked open. 2 men, their faces uncovered, carrying no visible weapons, but the way they stood told a woman alone at 2 in the morning on an empty road that they didn't need weapons to make their message clear. The man standing closer seized Lydia's left wrist and pulled her halfway out of the vehicle. Not hard enough to break bone, but hard enough to bruise, hard enough for her to know that next time would be harder. The second man shoved her right shoulder against the car door frame, held her there, and spoke close to her face, his voice as ordinary as if he were reading a delivery address. "Stop coming to the Kane mansion. Final warning." Then they let go, stepped back, got into their car, and vanished down the dark road before Lydia could catch her breath. She sat in the van, tilted on the grassy shoulder, her left wrist aching, her right shoulder sore, her right hand shaking so badly she couldn't grip the steering wheel. And she cried. Not because of the pain. She cried because she was afraid. The kind of fear she thought she had gotten used to after 27 years of living in Bridgeport. But it turned out she had never gotten used to it, because this wasn't the fear of being robbed or burglarized. This was the fear that came from realizing she had stepped into something much larger than herself, And that thing had just told her it knew where she was, which road she took, and what time she came home. Lydia wiped her face, drove the van off the grassy shoulder, and headed back to Bridgeport. She didn't call the police. She didn't call Everett. She checked that Mrs. Ruth was sleeping, locked the door, and sat in the darkness of the living room, looking down at her left wrist as the bruise slowly deepened. And for the first time since she had knelt beside the dog in the garden that night, Lydia Mercer truly wondered whether the money Everett Kane paid her was worth the price someone else was forcing her to pay. Lydia came to the mansion the next night because she had no other choice she could live with. She had spent the entire afternoon sitting on the bed, watching the bruise on her left wrist turn from red to purple, thinking about not going back, thinking about calling Everett and telling him she was done, thinking about returning the money he had transferred into her account and going back to her old life. But the old life meant the rent was still 3 months late, Mrs. Ruth's medicine was still short, and Noah still called every week with a voice trying to sound cheerful, though he couldn't hide the fact that he was eating 1 meal a day because he didn't have enough money. Lydia pulled the sleeve of her jacket down to cover her wrist, drove the van to the mansion, made the delivery, and went out to the garden to care for Cerberus like every other night. The dog waited for her at the side gate as usual, pressed his nose into her hand, and lay down so she could check the wound on his leg as it slowly healed. Lydia sat on the grass, opened the first aid kit, and began washing Cerberus's leg with warm water. She was reaching to her right for the roll of bandage when the sleeve of her jacket rode up with the motion, and the dark purple bruise on her left wrist appeared beneath the garden lights, clear, deep, the shape of someone's 4 fingers printed on her skin like an exact map of violence. She didn't realize it had shown until she heard the footsteps stop. Everett stood 3 meters away from her, the exact distance he always kept when he came out to the garden on recent nights, but his eyes weren't on Cerberus. His eyes were on her wrist. Lydia pulled the sleeve down at once, but both of them knew the movement had come too late. The silence between them stretched long enough for Lydia to hear Cerberus breathing and the crickets in the bushes near the fence. Then Everett asked, his voice ordinary, neither rising nor falling, as if he were asking about the weather. "What happened to your wrist?" Lydia didn't look at him. She looked down at Cerberus, her hands continuing to wrap the bandage around the dog's leg, and said, "Things in the van fell on it when I had to brake hard. It's nothing." She said the sentence naturally enough, because she had practiced it in her head all afternoon. And if Everett had been anyone else, maybe he would have believed it, or at least accepted it without asking more. But Everett Kane had spent 17 years in a world where lies were the primary language, and he had learned to read them more fluently than English. He didn't say she was lying. He didn't force her to tell the truth. He only looked at her for a few more seconds, then gave one small nod, turned, and walked back into the mansion. But that nod wasn't acceptance. Lydia was smart enough to know that, and she was also tired enough that she no longer had the strength to care what he would do with the information his eyes had just gathered. 3 hours later, when Lydia had already returned to Bridgeport and was lying in bed beside Mrs. Ruth, Everett Kane sat in his study with the phone pressed to his ear and gave one single order to the private security team Ford Beckett did not control. The team Everett kept completely separate from the main system, because his instincts had always told him that every organization needed one layer even the closest person couldn't see. He ordered them to trace every vehicle that had traveled the route from the mansion to Bridgeport over the past 3 nights, cross-checking it with traffic cameras and the automatic toll system. The results came in before dawn. The black sedan the system had recorded appearing repeatedly on that route for 3 nights in a row was registered under the name of a company called Meridian Logistics, with an address listed as a virtual office in Hartford. Everett read the company name, and everything inside him went cold, because Meridian Logistics wasn't an unfamiliar company. It was one of more than 20 shell companies his own organization used to register vehicles, properties, and accounts they didn't want tied directly to his name. And the list of people authorized to use vehicles registered under Meridian Logistics was short. So short that Everett didn't need to read it to the end, because the first 3 names were enough, and one of those 3 names was Ford Beckett. Everett set the phone down. He didn't slam the desk, didn't throw the glass, didn't call anyone. He only sat there in the study, looking at Ford Beckett's name on the screen. And for the first time in 17 years, he looked at that name not with trust, but with a question he had never thought he would have to ask. If Ford was capable of having a delivery girl followed and threatened without telling him, then what else was Ford capable of doing that Everett didn't know about? Petra Shaw, came to the mansion on the evening of the third day after receiving the order to investigate, carrying a black leather briefcase and a face without expression, a face Lydia would later learn was the only face Petra had, not because the woman had no emotions, but because she had served as a shadow lawyer for people like Everett Kane long enough to understand that emotion on the face was free information, and free information in this world could get someone killed. Petra sat across from Everett in the study, opened the briefcase, laid out a file thinner than Everett had expected, and began to speak. "I searched back 17 years, Petra said, her voice flat, precise, as if she were reading a financial report. Monroe Kane and Warren Kane disappeared on March 12th, 17 years ago. Since that date, there has been no digital trace of either of them in any system in the United States." She turned the pages one by one. No plane tickets purchased under the names Monroe Kane or Warren Kane on any domestic or international airline. No car rental agreements. No bank transactions. No cash withdrawals. No transfers. No new accounts opened. No medical records at any hospital, clinic, or pharmacy in the federal system. No tax filings. No vehicle registrations. No rental agreements. No utility bills under their names. No applications for replacement documents. Nothing. Two people who had lived 6 decades on American soil, who had had a child, who had worked, who had paid taxes, who had existed in every system where an ordinary citizen exists, and after March 12th of that year, they had vanished cleanly from every database, as if they had never existed at all. Petra closed the file and looked at Everett. "Ordinary people don't disappear that cleanly," she said. "When ordinary people leave, they still need to rent a place, still need to buy food, still need medical care. They leave traces, whether they want to or not, because the modern system doesn't allow anyone to live without touching at least one database. To turn 2 human beings into 0 in every system at the same time requires resources, access, and knowing exactly where to erase, and exactly when." She stopped. "Only someone in our line of work could do this." Everett sat motionless. That sentence wasn't new information to him, not after last night, when he had seen Ford Beckett's name on the Meridian Logistics list, but hearing Petra confirm it with concrete evidence was different from suspecting it alone in the dark. Suspicion could be wrong, evidence couldn't, but Petra wasn't finished. She opened a second file, thinner than the first, only a few pages, and set it in front of Everett with an expression that, if Petra Shaw had expressions, was the closest thing to surprise she allowed herself to show. "During the trace, I checked everyone connected to the Kane family before the disappearance," Petra said. "Old medical records, the family doctor, the private clinic the family used to visit, and I found a name." She pointed to the middle page of the file. Everett looked down. The clinic name, Hartford Family Medical, an address in Hartford, Connecticut, closed 15 years ago. A list of medical staff from the period when the Kane family had been patients, nearly 4 decades earlier. And on that list, under obstetric care nurse, was a name, Ruth Holloway. Everett read the name twice. Then he looked up at Petra. "Ruth Holloway," Petra said. "Born in 1945, currently 81 years old. Current address, Bridgeport, Connecticut. Diagnosed with late-stage Alzheimer's." She paused for exactly 1 beat. "Lydia Mercer's grandmother." The room went silent. Everett looked at the name Ruth Holloway on the page, then over at the ring in the plastic bag on the desk, then at the piece of cloth that said, "Help me," beside it, and he saw the thing he hated most in the world. A picture forming beyond his control, the pieces finding their way to one another from directions he had never anticipated. The grandmother of the delivery girl, once having been the nurse who cared for his mother nearly 4 decades ago, leading up to the moment Everett was born, long before this empire existed, long before anything in his life had become violent and complicated. "Does Lydia Mercer know about this?" Everett asked. "I don't think so," Petra said. "She's 27. This happened before she was born. And given Mrs. Ruth's current condition, I doubt she remembers anything at all." Everett nodded, but he thought of the night in the garden, of Lydia telling him about Mrs. Ruth, of her voice when she said, "Every morning I have to introduce myself again." And he wondered whether, inside Ruth Holloway's mind as it lost memory piece by piece, there might still be some fragment left about the Kane family, about Monroe Kane, about whatever had happened nearly 4 decades ago at the clinic in Hartford, where those 2 women had first met. Petra took 2 more days to complete the most important part of the investigation. She had obtained samples of Monroe Kane's handwriting from old records at Hartford Family Medical, patient registration forms, consent for treatment forms, insurance information sheets, all of them bearing Monroe's signature, and several handwritten lines from nearly 4 decades earlier. She also found handwriting samples closer to the time of the disappearance. Everett's school enrollment forms, a medical power of attorney signed when Everett was 16, and a thank you card sent to the family doctor that the clinic had kept in its files. Petra placed the farewell letter beside the handwriting samples and used the document comparison method she had applied to dozens of disputed wills and forged contracts throughout her career as a shadow lawyer. The result wasn't vague. The handwriting in the farewell letter looked very much like Monroe's, close enough that a panicked 19-year-old son would never have doubted it. But when placed beside the genuine samples, the differences appeared clearly. The letter E in Everett's name, Monroe always wrote it with an open curve at the top, while the letter used a closed curve. The spacing between words, Monroe wrote with more open space, while the letter was tighter. Pen pressure. Monroe was left-handed, her strokes darkening on the right side of each downward line, while the letter had heavier pressure on the left, a trait typical of a right-handed person trying to imitate a left-handed one. Petra gave Everett the conclusion at 10 o'clock at night. This letter wasn't written by Monroe Kane. Someone copied her handwriting, and did it very well, but not perfectly. Everett held the letter he had kept in his desk drawer for 17 years, the letter he had read hundreds of times in those early years, until he knew every word by heart, and every word felt like a knife. The letter he had used as fuel to burn away every soft thing inside him and build an empire from the ashes. And he realized that 17 years of hatred, 17 years of telling himself he had been abandoned, 17 years of turning himself into something even he no longer recognized in the mirror, had all been built on the foundation of a piece of paper written by the person he had trusted most in the world. He didn't summon Ford. He went looking for Ford. At 2 in the morning, Everett opened the door to Ford Beckett's room on the 2nd floor of the mansion without knocking, turned on the light, and stood in the doorway with the letter in his right hand and Petra's analysis in his left. Ford sat up in bed, his eyes narrowing against the light, and for the first 2 seconds he was still moving from sleep into wakefulness, but by the 3rd second, when he saw the letter in Everett's hand and saw the look on Everett's face, Ford Beckett understood. No one needed to say anything. He had prepared for this moment for 17 years, not by preparing an explanation, but by preparing himself for the day the wall he had built would collapse. And looking into Everett's eyes now, he knew that wall had just finished collapsing. "I kept this letter for 17 years, Everett said, his voice so low it was almost a whisper, but every word was sharp as a freshly honed blade. For 17 years I believed my mother wrote it. For 17 years I built everything I have on the truth that they left me." He stopped. "You wrote it. It wasn't a question." Ford looked at Everett for a long time. Then he didn't deny it, because denying proof was something Ford Beckett considered an insult to the intelligence of both sides. And whatever else he wasn't a fool. 17 years ago, you were a 19-year-old kid who had just completed his first mission, Ford said, his voice calm, without regret, without fear, calm, as if he were explaining a business decision. "You had potential I had never seen in anyone, but you still had somewhere to go back to. You still had a mother cooking dinner, a father sitting at the head of the table, a door that was always open. A man who still has a place to return to never fully belongs to the organization. I needed you to have nothing left." He paused, not because he was emotional, but because he was choosing the next words with precision. "I went to see your parents. I told them that if they didn't leave within 24 hours and cut off all contact with you forever, I would kill you. It wasn't an empty threat. I showed them enough proof for them to believe that I could do it, and that I would. They left. I wrote the letter. I turned the garden into a forbidden zone because right before she was taken away, your mother went out into the garden alone for 20 minutes, and I didn't know what she buried there. I only knew she had buried something, and I couldn't dig it up because you would ask why." He looked at Everett. "I created you, Everett. Everything you have today, the empire, the power, the cruelty people fear, all of it exists because I cut away the one thing that made you weak." Everett stood in the doorway, the letter in his hand, and looked at the man he had treated like a father for 17 years. He didn't shout. He didn't strike him. He didn't draw a gun, though he could have, and no one in the mansion would have asked a question. He only said, very slowly. "You didn't create me. You destroyed me. Then you built what you needed from the wreckage." He called the guards. 2 men appeared within 30 seconds. "Confine him," Everett said. "Private room. Lock the door from the outside. No phone, no contact." When the guards took Ford out of the room, he didn't resist, but he added one final sentence as he passed Everett. "Your parents are still alive. I didn't kill them. I only hid them." The door closed. Everett stood alone in Ford's room, in the smell of tobacco and old leather, and 17 years of belief, the belief he had built his entire life upon, lay shattered beneath his feet like glass. Everett called Lydia the next morning. Not when she came to make a delivery, but by phone at 10 in the morning, the first time he had ever called her during the day, and his voice on the phone was different from his voice in the garden. Not colder, not warmer, but tired. The kind of tired Lydia recognized instantly, because she heard it in her own voice every morning. He said only one sentence to her. "Your grandmother used to be the nurse who cared for my mother." Then he went silent and waited for her reaction. Lydia stood in the kitchen of the Bridgeport apartment, the phone pressed to her ear, looking through the bedroom door where Mrs. Ruth was taking her afternoon nap on the bed with the blanket pulled up to her chin, and she couldn't say anything for 10 seconds because everything had just shifted. The night Mrs. Ruth had said Kane, "Be careful," was no longer a random fragment from a mind falling apart. It was a real memory. Mrs. Ruth knew the name Kane because she had once known a woman who carried the Kane name, and that woman was Everett's mother. Lydia set the phone down after Everett told her to ask Mrs. Ruth if she could. Anything she still remembered, any fragment at all. He didn't give an order. For the first time, he spoke to her in the voice of someone asking, not someone demanding, and the difference was small, but Lydia heard it as clearly as the sound of a door opening. That afternoon, Lydia sat beside Mrs. Ruth's bed and waited. Alzheimer's had no schedule. Moments of clarity came when they wanted to come and disappeared when they wanted to disappear, and there was no way to call them out. All she could do was sit there and wait, like sitting by the edge of the sea, waiting for one particular wave without knowing whether it would ever come. Lydia held her grandmother's hand, rubbed lavender oil into her palm out of habit, and spoke gently. She didn't push. She didn't ask directly. She only mentioned Hartford, mentioned the clinic, mentioned the days when Mrs. Ruth had worked as a nurse, and watched to see whether any fragment would rise. More than an hour passed with nothing. Mrs. Ruth looked at her with gentle but empty eyes, sometimes smiling without any clear reason, sometimes holding Lydia's hand tighter and then letting it go again. Lydia had almost given up when Mrs. Ruth abruptly sat upright in bed. Not slowly, not vaguely. She sat straight up, her eyes wide open, her hand gripping Lydia's with a force so strong that Lydia startled. And she looked at her granddaughter with an expression Lydia hadn't seen in nearly 2 years, the expression of Mrs. Ruth before the illness, sharp, focused, deep, with someone there behind those eyes instead of the emptiness Lydia had grown used to. "Monroe," Mrs. Ruth said, clearly, lucidly, as if that name were the key that had opened a door Alzheimer's thought it had locked forever. "You knew Monroe?" Lydia asked, her voice trembling because she was afraid that if she spoke too loudly or too quickly, that door would slam shut again. "Mrs. Ruth nodded. "My girl. Not my blood child, but I cared for her from the time she was pregnant with her first baby. I was her nurse at the Hartford clinic. She was so afraid, only in her 20s, her husband always working, no mother of her own beside her. I stayed with her through all 9 months." Mrs. Ruth stopped, her eyes looking far away as if the clinic room from nearly 4 decades earlier had appeared in front of her. "After that, she and I still kept in touch. She called me often, told me about the boy, Everett." Lydia stopped breathing when she heard her say that name. "Then years later, Mrs. Ruth continued, her voice beginning to slow, as if the door were gradually closing. "She came looking for me. At night. Crying. So scared. She said she had to go. Couldn't explain why, but she asked me for one thing." Mrs. Ruth looked straight into Lydia's eyes, and in that moment, granddaughter and grandmother looked at each other with a clarity they hadn't had in a very long time. She said, "If anyone with the Kane name ever comes looking, tell them, the back garden. I left everything in the back garden." Mrs. Ruth repeated that sentence once more, slowly, as if reading words that had been carved inside her mind for nearly 20 years, words she had carried through every lucid day and every sleepless night, until Alzheimer's began erasing everything. "I kept that message," Mrs. Ruth said, her voice fading. "I kept it for so long, but then I started to forget. I forgot her name. I forgot the clinic. I forgot everything except—" She stopped, her forehead creasing as if she were trying to hold on to something slipping out of her hand. "Except Kane. And be careful. I didn't remember why. I only knew I had to say it." Then her eyes clouded over again. Her hand let go. She sank lightly back onto the pillow. And when she looked at Lydia again, her gaze had returned to that gentle emptiness, not recognizing her own granddaughter, and the door had closed. Lydia sat beside her grandmother's bed, tears running down her face without wiping them away, and understood that she hadn't delivered to the Kane mansion by accident. Monroe Kane had planted a seed nearly 20 years earlier when she asked Mrs. Ruth to carry that message, and that seed had lived inside Mrs. Ruth's mind for all those years, surviving every wave of Alzheimer's, eating away at her memory, until her granddaughter, Lydia, the woman who had spent her whole life choosing compassion over self-protection, stood in a forbidden garden at midnight and knelt beside a wounded dog because she couldn't walk away when a living creature was in pain. Nothing was accidental. Monroe had created a road home before she was forced to leave, through Mrs. Ruth, through Lydia, through the ring buried in the garden, through the dog that never stopped digging. And that road had taken nearly 20 years to complete, but it had completed itself. Lydia came to the mansion at 9 o'clock at night, earlier than her usual delivery time, and she wasn't carrying any crates. The guard at the gate looked at her with hesitation, but someone inside had already allowed her in, because the gate opened without her needing to ring. She walked along the path through the back garden, past the place where Cerberus usually waited, but the dog wasn't at the side gate tonight. He was curled up on the back steps of the mansion, as if he too could sense that tonight was not like the other nights. She found Everett in the study on the first floor, but he wasn't sitting at his desk. He was standing beside the window, looking out at the garden, his back turned to her, and there was something different in the room that took Lydia a few seconds to recognize. The chair Ford Beckett usually sat in had been moved. Not moved to another spot in the room. Removed completely. As if Everett couldn't bear to look at the empty chair in the place where the man had sat for 17 years, so he had taken it out entirely. And the empty space it left on the carpet, the square depression where the 4 chair legs had pressed down for so many years, looked exactly like a scar. Everett turned when he heard her footsteps. His eyes were different. Lydia had looked into those eyes through enough nights in the garden to recognize the change. Not sadness, not anger, but emptiness. The kind of emptiness in a person who had just had everything inside him pulled out and had nothing new yet to fill the place. For 17 years, he had built an empire on the belief that he had been abandoned. And that belief, painful as it was, had been his foundation. Now the foundation had been broken, but the house was still standing, and Everett was standing inside that house, not knowing when it would fall. "Ford is confined on the 2nd floor," he said, his voice flat, delivering facts rather than sharing feelings. He confessed. He forced my parents to disappear, wrote the fake letter, turned the garden into a forbidden zone because he knew my mother had buried something before she was taken away. He stopped. "My parents are still alive." The last 3 words fell from his mouth heavily, not because he didn't believe them, but because he didn't yet know where to put them inside himself, didn't yet know whether those 3 words were good news or only another kind of pain. Lydia sat down in the chair across from him, in the exact place where Ford used to sit, but since the chair had been removed, she pulled another one from the corner of the room, and she told Everett everything Mrs. Ruth had said that afternoon. She told him about Monroe coming to the Hartford clinic nearly 4 decades earlier, in her 20s, pregnant, frightened, and about Mrs. Ruth staying beside her through all 9 months. She told him about the connection that continued for years afterward, the phone calls, the stories about the baby named Everett. And she told him about the night Monroe came looking for Mrs. Ruth, crying, afraid, saying she had to leave, and asking her to keep a message. "If anyone with the Kane name ever came looking, tell them, the back garden. I left everything in the back garden." Everett listened without interrupting. He sat motionless, his eyes on Lydia, but she knew he was looking through her, looking at the image of his mother nearly 20 years ago, standing and crying in the doorway of a nurse's home in Bridgeport, leaving one last message before being forced to disappear, because she knew Ford would block every letter, every phone call, every direct way of reaching out. But Ford didn't know about Mrs. Ruth, didn't know about the nurse Monroe had been close to for nearly 2 decades. And that was the only crack Monroe had found in the wall Ford had built around her son. "She didn't leave you," Lydia said softly. "She was forced to go, and before she went, she did everything she could to create a way back. She buried the ring and the plea for help in the garden. She sent a message through my grandmother. She bet on the hope that one day, someone would find it." Everett closed his eyes, not for long, only for a few seconds. But when he opened them again, Lydia saw something she had never seen in this man before. Water. Not tears falling, only a thin sheen of moisture covering eyes that had been dry as stone for 17 years. And he blinked once to erase it, before it became something he couldn't control. "I hated them," he said, his voice low. And Lydia understood that he wasn't speaking to her so much as speaking aloud something he needed to hear himself say. "For 17 years, I hated the 2 people who sacrificed everything so I could live." Lydia didn't say, "It wasn't your fault," because she knew that sentence was meaningless. She didn't say, "Everything will be all right," because she didn't know whether it would be. She only said the thing she knew was true, because she lived with it every day. "My grandmother doesn't recognize me every morning," Lydia said. "Every morning, I sit beside her and tell her who I am, and she looks at me like I'm a stranger. But I still come back. Every morning, because love doesn't need the other person to remember you in order for it to exist." Everett looked at her, and in his eyes then, Lydia saw something shift. Not another collapse, but the first thing being placed where the old foundation had just been destroyed. A new brick. Small, not enough to rebuild anything yet, but enough to mark that something would be rebuilt here. "My parents are in Maine," he said. "Ford said they're living on the coast under different names." He stood. "I have to go." Lydia nodded. She didn't ask whether he needed her to come with him, because she understood that this was a journey Everett had to take alone, the same way she sat beside Mrs. Ruth alone every morning, because there are some things a person has to face with no one standing in between. He went to the study door, stopped, and didn't turn back, but spoke just loudly enough for her to hear. "Thank you, for not burying again what you dug up." Then he left, and Lydia remained sitting alone in Everett Kane's study, beside the square empty space on the carpet where Ford Beckett's chair had once stood, and she understood that everything, the ring, the piece of cloth, the dog, Mrs. Ruth, herself, all of them were pieces Monroe Kane had scattered nearly 20 years ago, in the hope that one day they would find one another, and tonight they had. Everett drove for 5 hours through the night, from Connecticut up to Maine, across empty stretches of highway where the streetlights grew farther apart, and then disappeared completely as he left the larger towns behind and went deeper into the northeastern coast, to the place where Petra had traced the last address of the 2 people who had lived under false names for nearly 2 decades. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't call anyone. He only drove, both hands on the wheel, eyes on the road, while inside his head there was a war between 17 years of hatred, trying to hold its ground, and something new trying to push it aside. Something that didn't yet have a name because Everett Kane didn't have the vocabulary for things like hope, or the fear of being disappointed again. He arrived just as morning was breaking. The house was small, 1 story, its white paint yellowed with age, standing about 100 meters from the sea road, with neat flower beds in the front yard, and a low wooden fence that someone repainted often because there wasn't a single peeling spot. It was the kind of house people chose when they wanted to live without being found. Small enough not to draw attention, far enough away that no one asked questions, but still with flower beds and a freshly painted fence, still with signs that the people living inside hadn't given up on living. Everett sat in the car for another 10 minutes before stepping out, not because he hesitated, but because he was trying to imagine what his mother's face would look like after 17 years. And he realized that he couldn't, because his memory had frozen her face at 43, the last time he had seen her, and everything after that was empty space. He got out of the car, walked through the low wooden gate, followed the stone path to the front door, and knocked. Not hard. 3 soft knocks. The kind of knock he didn't remember learning from anywhere, but his hand did it on its own, as if muscle remembered what the mind had tried to forget. Footsteps sounded inside. Slow, light. Then the door opened. The woman standing on the threshold was 60 years old, her hair completely silver, thinner than the woman frozen in his memory, but thin in the way of someone who had spent many years carrying something heavy inside, not thin from hunger. Her face had more wrinkles than he remembered, around her eyes, around her mouth, across her forehead, wrinkles that 17 years of worry and longing and waiting had carved into her skin like lines only time could write. But her eyes hadn't changed. Monroe Kane looked at him, and Everett felt the 17 years between them shrink into nothing, because those were the eyes he saw every night in his dreams, the eyes he had believed had abandoned him, when in truth they had been crying for him for nearly 2 decades inside this small house by the sea. Monroe looked at her son. Both her hands rose to cover her mouth, and she cried, not softly, not with quiet tears, but with the kind of crying that comes from someone who has held something inside for too long and has just broken all at once. All of it. A cry that shook her shoulders, shook her whole body, the kind of crying she had probably done alone for thousands of nights, but had to smother every time because there was no one there to cry with her. Now there was. Heavier footsteps came from behind Monroe. Warren Kane appeared in the hallway, 63 years old, his hair white, far older than the man in Everett's memory, but standing straight, back straight, shoulders straight, the posture of a man who had endured for a very long time and refused to collapse, even when no one was watching. He saw Everett and stopped in the middle of the hallway, not coming any closer, saying nothing, only standing there with one hand braced against the wall as if he needed something to keep him upright. "I thought you left me," Everett said. His voice broke on the last word. Not much, only a small crack, but enough for Monroe Kane to step forward and hold her son for the first time in 17 years. She was smaller than he remembered, or maybe he was larger than he remembered, and when she embraced him, her head only reached his chest. But the force of her hold was not small at all. She held him as if, should she let go, he would disappear again, and this time he would never come back. Warren came over and placed one hand on Everett's shoulder without saying anything, because he was the kind of man who didn't speak when he could touch, and his hand on his son's shoulder said more than any sentence he could have spoken. They went inside the house. They sat around the small kitchen table with cups of tea no one drank. Warren told the story, his voice even, but every sentence heavy. Every year he had written letters to Everett, and every year the letters were returned or never arrived at all. He had tried to call, but the numbers were blocked. Monroe had tried to come back twice. The first time Ford had people stop her at the Connecticut border, and the second time he sent a photograph of Everett taken from a distance with one single line. "Next time, I won't be taking a picture." They stopped because they believed that if they kept trying, Everett would die. Everett listened without interrupting. When Warren finished, he reached into the pocket of his coat and took out the ring. Platinum, old, M.K. forever, W. He placed it on the table in front of Monroe. Monroe looked at the ring, and her hands trembled. She picked it up, turned it between her fingers, read the inscription inside, the one she had read thousands of times in her life, and her tears fell onto the tabletop. But this time she smiled through them. "I buried it because I believed," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I didn't know what would dig it up. I didn't know when. But I believed that one day, something would find it." Everett told her about Cerberus, the dog that had dug in the same place every night for months. And he told her about Lydia, the delivery girl who had knelt beside a wounded dog because she couldn't walk away. And he told her about Mrs. Ruth, the elderly nurse with Alzheimer's who had carried Monroe's message for nearly 2 decades, until the disease had stolen almost everything but had still left 2 words behind. Kane, and be careful. Monroe cried again when she heard Ruth's name, but this time, she wasn't crying from pain. She was crying from something Everett had never seen anyone cry from before. Gratitude so deep, it was almost unbearable. "Ruth kept her promise," Monroe said, her voice breaking. After all that time, after everything, she still kept her promise. And Everett Kane, 36 years old, the man the entire underworld called a monster, sat in the small kitchen of a house on the Maine coast with the parents he had believed had abandoned him. And for the first time in 17 years, he didn't feel the need to control what was rising inside him. So he let it rise, and it didn't destroy him the way he had always feared. It only flowed out through his eyes, quiet, warm, and he didn't wipe it away. Ford Beckett was handed over to the federal justice system 3 weeks after the night he confessed. Everett didn't hand him over directly, because in his world, no one handed anything over directly. He sent every piece of evidence of Ford's criminal activities over the past several decades through an anonymous channel Petra Shaw had set up, a channel even the FBI couldn't trace back to its source. And 3 weeks later, Ford Beckett was arrested at a motel in Hartford, where Everett's guards had released him exactly 2 hours before federal agents knocked on the door. Everett didn't kill Ford, not because he forgave him, but because he refused to let Ford define him one more time. Killing Ford would have meant reacting exactly the way Ford had trained him to react for 17 years, with violence, with the cruelty Ford had carefully nurtured since the night Everett was 19 years old, standing in an empty house with a forged letter in his hand. Ford would live, but he would live in federal prison until he died, and every day he would wake up knowing that the perfect weapon he had spent 17 years creating had broken its own chains and walked away, and there was nothing he could do except sit there and watch. Monroe and Warren Kane moved back to Connecticut 2 months after the reunion, not into the mansion, because Monroe refused to live in a place that carried the shadow of the empire Ford had built out of her son's pain. But they bought a small house 15 minutes from the mansion, with a front garden, a white fence, and a kitchen large enough for 3 people to sit down to breakfast without feeling crowded. Every Sunday, Everett drove over. He parked in front of the house, walked into the kitchen, sat down in the chair Monroe had already pulled out for him, and ate breakfast with his parents. He didn't know what to say during those first breakfasts, because 17 years without parents had erased every habit and every language that had once belonged to family. So he sat there, eating the eggs Monroe made, drinking the coffee Warren brewed, and learning how to be a son again at 36, slowly, awkwardly, sometimes silent for the entire morning. But he came back every Sunday, and that said more than anything he could have put into words. Mrs. Ruth Holloway was moved into the best Alzheimer's care facility in Connecticut, a place Lydia had never dared dream of before because the cost was equal to an entire year of her delivery wages. Monroe visited Mrs. Ruth every week. The first time Monroe stepped into Mrs. Ruth's room, she sat down beside the bed, held the hand of the woman who had once cared for her through her pregnancy nearly 4 decades earlier, and said, "Ruth, it's Monroe, Mrs." Ruth looked at Monroe with the familiar, empty eyes of late-stage Alzheimer's, not recognizing her, not remembering. But Monroe didn't let go of her hand. She sat there all afternoon, speaking gently, telling her about the old days, about the Hartford clinic, about the 9 months Ruth had spent beside her, and when Monroe stood up to leave, she promised she would come back the following week, and she kept that promise, every week, never missing a visit, because Monroe Kane knew better than anyone the value of a promise kept across time. Lydia no longer delivered to the Kane mansion, because she no longer needed to work the night shift. Everett had paid off all her debts before she could object, and when she did object, he looked at her and said, "This isn't pity. This is because you treated my dog's wound that night. You did more than you know." Noah received a full scholarship to college, funded by an education foundation Petra Shaw created under a name no one could connect back to Everett Kane. And Lydia, for the first time in her life, could sleep for more than 4 hours a day. But she still came to the mansion every evening. Not for money, not out of duty, because Cerberus still waited for her at the side gate every night, and she wasn't the kind of person who abandoned someone waiting for her, even if that someone was a dog. One early spring night, when the Connecticut air was just warm enough to sit outside in the garden without a jacket, Lydia sat on the grass beneath the familiar oak tree, with Cerberus lying beside her, and she heard the back door open. Footsteps on the gravel. Familiar. Slow, but tonight Everett didn't stop 4 meters away from her. He didn't stop 1 meter away. He sat down right beside her, shoulder touching shoulder, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his arm through the fabric of his shirt. And he didn't explain why he was sitting closer, because Everett Kane didn't explain. He simply did things, and each action of his was a sentence he didn't yet know how to speak aloud. They sat there for a long time. Cerberus lay between them, his head resting on Lydia's lap, his tail touching Everett's leg. A gentle wind moved through the garden, stirring the oak leaves, carrying the scent of the flowers Monroe had planted every Sunday in the very corner of earth that had once been forbidden, the place where the ring and the cloth had lain for nearly 2 decades, waiting to be found. Then Everett spoke, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on the dark garden ahead. "I don't know how to love anyone. I've never known how. For 17 years, all I knew was how to build walls and burn bridges. But if you give me time, I'll learn." Lydia didn't answer with words. She rested her head against his shoulder, gently, slowly, the way she had placed her hand on Cerberus's side the first night in the garden, the way she touched wounded creatures, without frightening them more. And Everett didn't go rigid. He didn't pull his shoulder away. He only sat there, with Lydia leaning against him, Cerberus at their feet, Monroe's flower garden around them, and for the first time in 17 years, Everett Kane didn't feel the need to control anything at all. The back garden of the mansion was no longer a forbidden place. The iron gate had been removed. The path had been laid again. And every Sunday, when Monroe came for breakfast, she brought seedlings with her, and spent the afternoon planting flowers in the patch of earth where, nearly 20 years earlier, she had knelt in the dark, alone and afraid, burying her wedding ring and the strip of cloth, asking for help with the fragile hope that something, someday, would find them. Now that place had flowers. It had sunlight. It had the soft sound of Monroe laughing when Warren brought the watering can out late. And in the middle of that flower garden, Cerberus slept, his head resting on Lydia's foot, all 4 legs stretched out, his belly slightly exposed, breathing evenly, the way a dog only lies when he feels absolutely safe. He didn't dig anymore. He didn't claw at the earth every night. He didn't whimper in the dark corner of the garden. He had found what he needed to find. Not the ring, not the cloth, but the thing Monroe Kane had buried with them nearly 20 years earlier. The hope that one day, someone would dig it up. And someone had dug. This story isn't only about a ring or a dog or an underground empire. It is about what all of us carry every day. The fear of being abandoned, the longing to be loved, and the truth that sometimes the people who love us most are the very people we believe have walked away. Life doesn't always give us answers at the right time, but if someone, somewhere, once planted a seed of love for you, that seed is still waiting. Whether 10 years or 20 years have passed, it is still waiting until the day you're ready to find it. If this story has touched you, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories like this every day. Please like and share this video with the people you love, because perhaps this is exactly the story they need to hear today. We would truly love to know how you feel after hearing this story. What does it bring to mind for you? Who does it remind you of in your real life? Please leave a comment and share the feelings from deep within your heart. We read every line and treasure every story you send us. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and may each day be peaceful and filled with love. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.